We are super honored to have a great speaker with us here today. Lanzillo is a member of Loaves and Fishes Catholic worker community in Duluth, Minnesota. In addition to being a co-founder of the Maurin Climate Roundtable for Catholic worker communities in the US, as well as the coordinator of the Duluth 365 Climate Initiative and producer of the Climate Duluth series on PACT-TV. In addition, he writes an ongoing series of columns about climate change for the Reader and Duluth News Tribune. Tone, take it away.
Thanks. Just want to thank you all for allowing me to be a part of this symposium. It's really a great honor. In our short time together, I thought I would just share kind of my own story and what's happened in the 66 years of my life that have brought me here today with you all, and then maybe share some reflections on the qualities it takes to do the kind of work that people like us are doing in regards to climate change and environmental justice. I'm originally from Louisville, Kentucky. I was born in November 27th, 1954, and then moved to Chicago for my high school years. And there were two events or experiences during my high school years that have stayed with me through all this time. One was 1968. I just turned 13, but 1968 kind of changed my perspective on the world. In 1968, we had the assassinations of Robert Kennedy and Martin Luther King. Also, we had a very violent political convention in Chicago. And then there was the national discourse on civil rights and the Vietnam War. And although I never told anybody for probably over 30 years, at the age of 13, I decided that if I was ever to be drafted, I was going to go to Canada. And I held on to that for a number of years. The other experience that has stayed with me and maybe triggered my sensitivity to environmental justice was, as a junior, I spent the summer of my high school year Sioux in South Dakota. And to be honest, my knowledge of Native American indigenous communities prior to that was probably cowboy movies and John Wayne. But the experience of spending some time on the reservation, it kind of woke me up as far as poverty, addictions, mental health issues among the indigenous communities. And that experience has stayed with me all this time. After Chicago, ended up going to Vanderbilt University, where I majored in political science. And because of that experience, I decided to return to Louisville after college and worked in various campaigns. I worked for a congressman named Ron Mazzoli, and then eventually was hired as a legislative aide for the Board of Aldermen in Louisville. And that was my first introduction to local politics. And then after Louisville, through several different steps, I ended up in Philadelphia, New Jersey, and lived there for about 28 years. And most of my experience in that area was in mental health. I worked for a regional trauma hospital called Cooper Hospital as a psychiatric social worker. I worked at a crisis center at Kennedy Hospital and spent a number of years working in a partial care outpatient program for adults. And from those experiences, I guess you could say I became more sensitized to the struggles that poor and homeless people were having with mental health issues and addictions. And hopefully gained a lot of valuable experience. During those years, the one thing I will mention that had a big impact upon me is between the years of 2004 and 2009, I used to spend weekends at a Benedictine monastery, St. Mary's Monastery in North Jersey. It was my first experience in a community and future life community. So it kind of planted the seed. And also during that time, I became a Benedictine oblate. And one of the creeds of oblates is, as they say, to be a constant witness of justice, compassion, and hope to all. And that phrase has stayed with me all this time. My arrival in Duluth came about in November 7th of 2017. I arrived on bus. And I came here to explore the life within a Catholic worker community. I actually picked 15 communities to visit and talk to. And Duluth was actually number 15 on the list, partly because of the weather and because in my mind, it was such a small town. But after a few weeks here, between Lake Superior and the woods and the people here, I was drawn in and decided to make the commitment to stay with this community. Loaves and Fishes, just to give you an idea, we have 4 houses in our community. The house I live in is called the Dorothy Day House, and we serve and work with men who are homeless. Right now, we have 4 men on our 2nd floor. And on the 3rd floor, where I'm speaking from, are the 3 volunteers that live here. And then on our 1st floor is like any other house with living room and dining room. And we have open hours for men to spend some time with us for a cup of coffee, a shower, just some support counseling. We also have a women and family house of hospitality. And across the street outside my window, we have a house for temporary foster care. And then our 4th house is a house for some of our other volunteers that cannot live in our other 3 houses. In my first year here in Duluth, I really focused on this house, working with the men, and began to get involved in several different social justice or economic justice initiatives. They included the Local Solutions to End Poverty. It's a program where we would hold forums for local candidates for office to talk to the public about what they were proposing to do to help those who are homeless, poor, and underprivileged. Also, our community was involved in the Homeless Persons Bill of Rights to identify the rights and protect those rights of homeless people in Duluth. And recently, we've got more involved in Black Lives Matter protests in Duluth and around this region. And as you may have seen in the national media, with Jane Fonda being in our state last week, we've, as a community, been pretty involved now with the indigenous communities in the Line 3 protests that are going on against the current, I guess, the new pipes they're laying down by Enbridge in Minnesota. Actually, my start in climate change and environmental justice started on my birthday, which was November 27th of 2018. I was asked to speak before a room full of college students at the University of Minnesota Duluth on being in a community in 160s. And I gave my regular spiel about Loaves and Fishes, but just before I sat down, I actually was thinking about my son who's in college in South Carolina. And I began to think about, as I'm speaking to the students, how much the world has changed from when I was a college student. And so I spent the last 5 minutes of that talk with these 50 college students and talked about climate change, the environment, and actually encouraged them to become more active. And I'm not sure where it came from, but I encouraged them to hold an environmental summit for high school and college students in Duluth. And actually, before I left the room that night, a group of college students came to me and asked if I would help them put on that summit in the spring of 2019, which we did. The other thing that happened the day after my birthday was the Duluth News Tribune began publishing columns that I was writing. And they were very supportive, and it gave me an outlet to share some of my thoughts and feelings about climate change and environmental justice. The summit we held in March of 2019, we had about 350 citizens from Duluth participate. We tried to cover topics from climate change to environmental justice. Bill McGibbon, who some of you know, was nice enough to produce a video speaking to Duluth to open up the summit. Also during that time, I was making changes in my personal life and decided to change my lifestyle. As I shared, I was trying to lead a more sustainable lifestyle. So I decided to no longer drive or own a car, got rid of most of my electronic equipment, downsized my clothes by about 90%, and really decided to not only simplify my life, but make it smaller and slower. And because of that, I was walking everywhere. So as soon as the environmental summit was over, some college students teased me and said, you need to walk a longer distance than just walking around Duluth. So I took up the challenge, and in April of 2019, I decided to walk from Philadelphia to Washington, DC. And in making that decision, I decided to just simply walk. And as I engaged people, I would ask them 3 or 4 questions about climate change or the environment and just create a dialogue during that 140-mile walk. And the 2 things that came out of that walk for me was I could see there was a true disconnection between human beings and people and nature. And also there was a lot of concern, whether I was talking to motorcyclists or hairdressers, but a lot of people would tell me they really didn't want to think about or talk about too much about climate change or environmental issues. It was just too stressful. And so when I came back from that walk, I had decided that I wanted to invest more time in working on climate change and environmental issues here in Duluth. The other thing that influenced me quite a bit, and probably most of you are familiar with her, is I saw on social media a video of Greta Thornburg. And I'm just going to share it because it's very quick. But when I heard this video of her talk, let me get to sure I get it right. Yes, it was at the UN Climate Change Conference in Poland in December of 2018. This had a significant impact upon me, and I'd just like to read it. It's very short, and it had a great influence upon some decisions I was to make after this. She stated that, my name is Greta Thornberg. I'm 15 years old and I'm from Sweden. I speak on behalf of Climate Justice Now. Many people say that Sweden is just a small country and it doesn't matter what we do. But I've learned that no one is too small to make a difference. And if a few children can get headlines all over the world just by not going to school, then imagine what we could all do together if we really wanted to. But to do, we have to speak clearly, no matter how uncomfortable that may be. You only speak of green, eternal economic growth because you are too scared of being unpopular. You only talk about moving forward with the same bad ideas that got us into this mess, even when the only sensible thing to do is to pull the emergency brake. You are not mature enough to tell it like it is. Even that burden you leave to your children. But I don't care about being popular, and I care about the climate justice and the living planet. We are about to sacrifice our civilization for the opportunity of a very small number of people to continue to make enormous amounts of money. We are about to sacrifice the biosphere so that rich people in countries like mine can live in luxury. But it's the suffering of the many which pay for the luxuries of the few. The year 2075, I will celebrate my 75th birthday. If I have children, maybe they will spend that day with me, and maybe they will ask me about you. Maybe they will ask why you didn't do anything, why there still was time to act. You say that you love your children above everything else, and yet you're stealing their future. So when I heard Greta speak, and I felt she was speaking to me, yeah, I decided that beyond my work here on Jefferson Street with Loaves and Community, I needed to do more in regards to climate change and environmental justice. So it all kind of began in September of 2019. One of the things that I sponsored with a few people was what was called the Climate Duluth Forum. We had found out that the international media was coordinating a campaign called Covering Climate Now with probably over 400 media partners from around the world. And in speaking to them, I found out that no media in the Duluth region had signed up to be partners for this campaign. So with help from some other people, we put together a citywide forum on September 16th. And luckily we had all the local media there. We had about 100 people come, and we had 11 speakers from different environmental climate groups talk about how important the news and information about climate change is, how important it is to the greater community, that we all needed to be educated. And that was so successful that a couple weeks after that, the local TV station called and asked if we would be willing to take the conversation that started at that forum and continued on public television. So in November of 2019, we began producing the Climate Duluth series, where I would interview various activists, writers, artists that were involved in climate change and environmental justice work in Duluth. We had to stop the conversations with COVID because City Hall closed down, and that's where the studios were. So when the studios do open up again, hopefully this fall, we'll pick up that TV series at PACT-TV. Some other things that a few of us decided to do is we felt there needed to be a citywide conversation about climate change and environmental justice. So in September 16th, actually, of last year, we began a conversation called Duluth 365. And it was to be open and to engage any citizen Duluth to talk about climate change, its impact upon a city like Duluth, and to talk about how we could create a more resilient, sustainable, and environmentally just city. And after about 6 months, we've engaged about 250 to 300 citizens. And probably starting this spring, we're going to take a lot of those ideas and incorporate them in documents or publications to present to the, I guess you could say, the community leaders in Duluth, be it our city council, our county commissioners, the mayor, and some of our business leaders. Besides that, I had always been writing for the Duluth News Tribune, and then we have a weekly publication that heard me speak called The Reader, and they asked me to write for them also. So after speaking to the Duluth News Tribune, we kind of agreed that I would write a bi-weekly column for The Reader. The one thing I like about The Reader is they're much more liberal than our daily newspaper, so I have a lot more flexibility on both the themes and copy that I present. And actually, after 13 columns, The Reader hasn't changed a word. So I'm very thankful for that. Some other things that have been presented to me is there's a national network called the Elders Climate Action Network. It's a circle network of elders, those who are 60 and older, who are concerned about climate change and environmental justice from Massachusetts to Oregon. And several of them asked me to join the conversation. So I've begun to be a part of their conversations and actions. And right now I'm kind of focused on 3 areas. The Climate Duluth show that I shared with you, we've decided to produce a podcast, which we'll start producing in April and probably do 2 or 3 shows a week. We'll not only cover climate change and environmental justice in Duluth, but hopefully we'll cover some regional issues in the Northland as well as around the country. Also have another event in April for about 11 days leading up to Earth Day. It's called Living Through the Climate Emergency. And we're going to be collecting stories from people throughout the community from all walks of life, where they'll talk about what their experiences have been living through this climate emergency, how it's affected them mentally, maybe their jobs, through the community. So we're going to collect those stories and then share those stories through various media outlets in Duluth, through probably 5 different media outlets, including radio and TV and newspaper. And then, as was mentioned in my introduction, continuing work on this new venture. It's called the Maurin Climate Roundtable. And Morin, I take that name from Peter Morin, who is one of the 2 co-founders of the Catholic worker movement. That was Peter Morin and Dorothy Day. And we decided to engage, there's probably over 200 Catholic work communities around the world, probably about 180 in the US. And we wanted to begin a dialogue with the Catholic work communities, not just about what's going on with climate change, but how our communities can be more involved in their local areas around issues of environmental justice. And I'm looking forward to seeing what develops with that initiative. What I thought I would do here is I wanted to share in some conversations I've had with students, what are some of the qualities I felt that were important in doing this work, And these are some of the qualities when I talk to high school students and college students that I think will, strengthen them in their work in the community when they're dealing with issues around climate change or environmental justice. And I just wanted to briefly share them. I think that the qualities that are very important is one, you have to be curious. If you're going to get involved in climate change or environmental justice work, you've got to be able to ask questions. And for me, that was very important because I realized when I got to my 60s, for myself, I began asking, like, where are all the birds? Where are all the butterflies? I realized that my experience in the environment had changed over the last 30, 40 years, and I didn't have answers to these questions. So I began doing research, reading publications by scientists. So I think if you're going to get involved in climate change or environmental justice, you've got to be curious. I also think you have to be critical. You have to have critical thinking. You've got to be willing to get involved in problem solving. Also, I think you have to be contextual. And what I mean by that is when you look at an issue like climate change or environmental justice, you need to look at all the relationships, all the linkages, because, and I'm sure most of you know this, if you're going to talk about environmental justice, you also have to talk about racial justice. You also have to talk about social justice, economic justice. It's all in the same matrix. You can't separate them out. And I didn't realize that, to be honest, until I joined this community and began working on some of these issues. I think you have to be community minded. And what I mean by that is if you're going to get involved, find other communities or people you can work with. Doing this kind of work alone can be extremely stressful and very exhausting. You've also got to be compassionate. And what I mean by that is not only show compassion towards yourself, but you have to develop a sense of compassion with the people you're going to work with. And some days are easier than others. We're only human, but I think you have to be and develop a sense of compassion in working with people, especially those who are homeless, poor, from lower income families. I also think you have to be what I call counterculture. And what I mean by that is for those of us in the US and in this Western culture, and what the values and meanings of this Western culture, many of them have to be challenged if we're going to address climate change and environmental justice. And so, especially for me, I've had to identify those things in our culture that I personally have had to challenge, especially as a white heterosexual man. I also tell students you need to be catalytic. What I mean by that is you need to find a way to be a catalyst in the work you want to do. Where can you put your time or energy where you'll be somewhat pivotal and or provide some sense of leverage, whether you're going to work at the local level, the state level, or on some global issue. And also, I think you really need to be courageous. I've thought a lot about this. It takes a lot of courage to step out of one's comfort zone and to challenge things that have been accepted for so long, including, for one thing, our capitalist system. And I think we have a little bit of time. I just want to read, this was a piece that I wrote for the Tribune. It came out in October of 2019. The title of the piece was Courage, a Must in Climate Change World. The first weekend in October, I was invited by Lisa Fitzpatrick, the founder of the Duluth Climate Mobilization Campaign, to join her at a 2-day training session in Chicago, sponsored by the Climate Emergency Project. As I sat there listening to the participants share their personal stories about what brought them to Chicago and why it's so important for each of them to address what they considered to be a climate emergency, it became apparent to me that they had one thing in common. There was this one value or quality they all shared, and it may have been the one thing that held them up as they acknowledged their anxiety and fears, and also fueled their desire and enthusiasm to get involved in the Climate Emergency Project. and it was courage. In his book, The Courage to Create by Rollo May, May wrote how essential it is for all of us in this age of limbo to possess courage. May said that we have a choice. We can withdraw from the world and maybe become paralyzed or apathetic. He warned us that if we choose this response, though, we give up our chance and opportunity to help in the forming of the future. Or he wrote, we can live into the future by leaping into the unknown. May wondered if we have the courage necessary to preserve our sensitivity, our awareness, and our responsibility in the face of radical change. And he asked if we were then able to participate and contribute to the forming of the new society. May believed it takes courage to do something new and to push into a forest where there are no well-worn paths and from which no one has returned to guide us. When I think about the climate change activists I met in Chicago and the many individuals in Duluth who have dedicated their life and resources to addressing climate change, I'm truly amazed by their focus and sense of commitment to the cause. In a time of radical change to our environment, it takes courage to open one's eyes, acknowledge what is happening, and in the words of May, mold the future in society more equitable and humane. It is that courage we all need to find. To live in the climate change world, you and I need the courage to read and listen to the most current and accurate news and information about climate change. We need the courage to face our fears and insecurities about climate change and continue exploring and embracing new ideas and approaches to living on this earth. For myself, I often have to stop, take a breath, and ask what I'm being called to do in this moment. David Wallace Wells wrote, I'm like every other American who has spent their life fatally complacent and willfully deluded about climate change and the environment, which is not the biggest threat human life on the planet has ever faced, but it is a threat of an entirely different category and scale. That is the scale of human life itself. For us living in Duluth, it's time to stop feeling paralyzed and apathetic and to find the courage to acknowledge our complacency and delusions. It's time to stop burying our heads in the sand or trying to hold on to beliefs and behaviors that hold us back. It's a time to find the courage to ask how we can change and transform our lives in this climate change world. You and I need to find the courage to create a more resilient, sustainable, and environmentally just city. And we need to find that courage now. I think we look into the future. I think to address climate change and environmental justice, there's a lot of layers here. And from my perspective, there are just so many things that we need to address and that have caused environmental injustice, not only in the US, but around the world. And that list involves so many things. I mean, as many of you know, there's a growing disparity between the rich and poor. There's quite a disparity between the carbon footprint of the rich versus the poor. We have challenges with authoritarian governments. We have challenges with global capitalism. And then when you tie in already what's happening with climate change, as far as the CO2 emissions, the rising temperatures, rising sea levels, the global transportation of trash and plastic waste, patriarchy, toxic masculinity, racism. I think that's what makes environmental justice a complex issue. And I think each of us individually can take or get involved in one aspect of environmental justice. Again, whether at the local or the national global level. Yeah, and I'm watching the time. I know we're trying to keep our opening comments to 30 minutes, so maybe I'll stop and just, take questions, maybe have a conversation for a little bit.
Thank you so much. Round of applause, everyone. That was awesome. Let me go to the chat and take a look at the questions that are there. Okay, so the first one is, it's interesting that you found such a strong disconnect and reluctance to discuss climate problems during your experience walking across the country. Do you feel that others in your generation care about environmentalism too? Why do you feel the disconnect is still so strong even among younger people?
Since then, I've thought about, I think there's certain categories in our community. And it feels funny for me to say this as a white man. I think one group that's very resistant to talking about climate change and environmental justice are basically white men. I just have to say, most white men that I know from my life, this is not a topic they want to talk about. And to be honest, when I'm in public, whether it's at a coffee shop or whatnot, yeah, a lot of the men that I know in the community, not Loaves and Fishes, but in the greater community, they want to talk about sports. They want to talk about their jobs, their vacations, their stocks. So there is a resistance, and a number of researchers and writers have actually talked about the white men's community and the resistance to climate change and environmental injustice. And then you've got certain elements of the corporate world. Of course, the fossil fuel companies, as some of you know, have been fighting even a conversation about climate change and environmental injustice since the 70s and 80s. Yeah, I think if any of you or any of us participate in a climate protest, conversation, forum, it's mainly made up of women, and God bless them. It seems like women are leading the fight on so many levels when it comes to climate change and the environment. In fact, if any of you do a Google search, in fact, I would ask you to do a Google search on environmental climate change groups and then put the word women in there and see how many groups come up. And then do the same and put men in the title and nothing will come up. So that's a little disheartening from my perspective. I must say that I meet more and more high school students get involved in the conversation, which I think is amazing. And I have to give credit in conversations I've had with probably 4 or 5 campuses across the country, including the University of Minnesota. There are more groups being founded to address not only climate change, but environmental injustice, water issues. And I think another issue is, and this comes from my background in mental health and counseling, to deal with this issue, to even think about it, to have a conversation, to get involved, it's very stressful. And now there's a number of articles and books coming out about the mental health consequences of climate change, and especially those who work in the field like scientists, activists. Yeah, it's just tough. And I'll be honest, I've written some articles about how my work in this area has affected me emotionally and what I have to do to provide support to myself, and of course the support I get from the community, which is invaluable. And I'll just wrap up with this. If you look at the last 4 years in our country, especially with the Trump administration, it was quite disheartening because so many things were going on, between the president withdrawing from the Paris agreements to the president, I think he cut the EPA by over 30%. He took climate change off some of the websites with the federal government. So that didn't help either. But that's a good question. Good question.
All right, next I'm going to read out a comment that was sent to me in the chat from someone who had to leave early, but they wanted to say thank you, Tone, for sharing your great story. And the next question in the chat here is, have you seen ageism in the environmental movement or faced pushback from younger people in the environmental justice space?
I will say this, as I mentioned earlier, I was recently asked to start working with a group called the Elders Climate Action Network. And in those conversations with people that are 60 and older, I mean, there's probably a number of people that at this point in their life, they don't want to be part of the conversation, but I'm meeting more and more people between 60s and the 90s who almost feel a responsibility that they didn't take this issue more seriously when they were younger. And they feel at this point in their lives that they want to serve as mentors or be a part of the conversation. And given that people between 60 and 90 have a lot of free time, I have met a number of people in that age group that have time to call a local politician, to send an email to a senator or congressman about a piece of legislation, or to stand on the streets and protest, whether it's a global or local issue. So that's been refreshing. And of course, on the other end, thank God there's been a number of youth movements, including the Sunrise Movement, that has been engaging young people for some years now. And we actually, in this area, it's made up of college, high school students, called the Youth Climate Strike Movement, where they get together for conversation and to show up for protest. And I do see more conversations going on between young people and older people. Here's where the void is. Now in Duluth, we're a predominantly white community, but we do have a significant indigenous community. Our Black community is fairly small, but what I've noticed is in most conversations, it's mainly white faces. So I think the thing we all need to do is when we have a conversation about climate change and the environment, we need to find ways to engage minority communities. And that has been a struggle. In fact, for the past 6 to 7 months, I and a few other people have been making attempts to reach out to like the NAACP in Duluth and other organizations like the Family Freedom Center to have a conversation about climate change and environmental justice. And it's been slow. It's been slow. But part of the reason we wanted to do that is we found out in 2018 that the city had commissioned a report on climate change and the city's vulnerability. And I was able to get a copy of the report. And there was a whole section on how people are unemployed, minorities, and still after almost 3 years, there's not been a community conversation about this report and engaging those vulnerable populations. So again, that's something else we're trying to work on.
Next in the chat here, I just have a comment from Melinda about how she's also seen the number of bees, butterflies, and other fauna decrease over the past couple of years of her experience. And the next question in the chat is, can you give an example of an experience or project where you had to step back or adjust the scope of a project due to the need for more intimate or relational context?
Wow. Boy, that's a good question. Wow. The best way I could answer that is the way I've approached everything I've done since I've come to Duluth. Everything I do is very personal. And whenever I start a project, I think about the current relationships I have with people in regards to doing that project, or the relationships I'll need to cultivate. Most of my life, I guess I had what's called the John Wayne mentality, that I didn't need help and I could do everything on my own. And I've changed where I realized that I'm not by myself, I'm not alone, and I can't do it by myself. So I guess I've been fortunate that it's like writing for the 2 newspapers in town. I spent some time cultivating a relationship with the 2 editors, which has been very beneficial in how I write and how I present my columns. when I decided to do the Climate Duluth series on PACT-TV, I spent some time actually with the staff at the TV station, just sharing my story and what I hope we could do, and impressing upon them that although I was the producer, I could not do it without them. I think the only challenge for me personally is learning how to say no, because there are some days I'll get 3 or 4 requests in a day to get involved in projects. And so that's been the biggest challenge, which I'm getting better at, is saying no. Yeah, because probably the last 3 or 4 months, my plate's kind of gotten full, and will probably get even busier when I return from an upcoming trip to the East Coast. Yeah.
The next question, and this one's from me, is what has been the reaction to your show and your column, as well as the dialogues and engagement that you've been doing in your community around climate change and environmental justice?
You know, it's kind of like I'm a musician, and a long time ago when I would write or play, I was so worried about the audience's reaction to my music. And I still play. And about 5 years ago, I decided, no, I'm playing for myself for a lot of reasons, and that's what gives me joy. So if someone else enjoys my performance, great. If not, that's fine too. And I've taken that mentality to my writing and my work. So to be honest, I'm actually surprised when someone stops me on the street to respond to a column, or I get some emails, or I think I'd written 3 columns and when I began, and I had this young man come up to me and said, I got rid of my truck. I knew him, his name was Robert. I said, why'd you get rid of your truck? I said, it's still working. And he said, yeah, but he said, I've been thinking about the fact that you walk around town all the time. You got rid of your car and you're doing da-da. He said, I've decided to make some changes in my life, and I'm no longer going to drive. Yeah, so on a weekly basis, I probably hear from about, well, 20 to 30 people in Duluth. And I guess every time I hear from someone, I try to stay humble. And yeah, I guess you could say I'm just surprised that either I said something or I wrote something that impacted someone else. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Fantastic that you've been getting such a positive response and that you've been able to inspire people in your community to make some changes in their own lives.
Yeah, it's been great. I mean, we, as a community, we're involved in various social justice issues, and I hope we'll do more with environmental justice. And recently we began talking about how to become a more sustainable community, including maybe in a few years incorporating solar panels on some of our houses. We are very involved in community gardening. We do a lot of recycling, composting. Yeah, so we do some very important things within the community. Yeah.
The next question here is, I'm sorry if I pronounce this wrong. Has Laudato Si influenced you? If so, how?
Who's that?
I'm not sure. Melinda, are you able to unmute and ask?
I am, sure. So that's the encyclical that Pope Francis wrote in 2015, Care for Our Common Home. Thank you.
Got it right here. I would say this book, I'll share a funny story. When I found the book, I've read this and underlined it several times. In fact, one of the reasons for the title of my talk today, which was Standing on Common Ground, came from reading this book. And I think a few takes I'll take from this book. When I walk, ground on is the spread, in India, it's the same ground in Bangladesh, it's the same ground in New Orleans. So I always remind myself that that's one thing among many things that we share, and that's one of many reasons why I should do the work I do. And I give some of that credit to Pope Francis. Also, the fact that he talked about climate change and climate justice and inequality. But I'll share one story. After I came in town and read this, I contacted the local diocese and asked if we could have a conversation between the Catholic work community, the Catholic Church, and the greater community, and they weren't interested. Yeah, and that's another thing I probably should share with everybody is, although we're called the Catholic Worker Movement, not everybody in the Catholic Worker Movement are Catholic. In fact, in our own community, we have agnostics, Quakers, Lutherans, Buddhists, Catholics, so it's quite a mix. But yeah, yeah, this is a book I'll probably carry for a while. Yeah.
Next question here is from Colton. I was wondering how you'd encourage us to go about talking with our elders about climate change, or maybe go about encouraging our families or even our congregations, if we're religious, to care about the climate.
You know what? The conversations are important, and they can probably happen on different levels. I think if you want to have a conversation with your elders, your church community, and this is just my take, is you ask yourself, what are you willing to do? How are you willing to change your own life? And then share those experiences with an elder, with the church. So let's just say someone decides to stop eating meat and become a vegetarian. Do a little research about the meat industry and its impact upon climate change. Maybe look at how it's improved your own life mentally and physically, and share that story. Another thing I always encourage people who are artists is to use your art to engage people. It's very non-threatening. And in fact, in November, for about 4 months, we did a project in Duluth where I got about maybe 28 artists and poets together to share their works with the greater community and to use creative arts to initiate another conversation about climate change and the environment. So creative arts is another way to approach it. It is a difficult conversation, and I know it's a conversation that a lot of people don't want to have. But you know what, I'll share this. I have 3 sisters and 2 sons. And when I moved up here, they thought I was crazy because now I live in a room that's 12 by 15. And I lead a very simple life, and they didn't understand it. But over time, as I continue to share my story, actually 2 of my sisters and 1 of my son are making changes in their own lives in regards to climate change and the environment. And I didn't ask them to. It was just by me sharing my story that over time, something clicked for them. But that's a good question. But I would say, yeah, you've got to look at yourself, take personal stock, maybe find one element or aspect of climate change that's really important to you, and use that interest as a gateway to begin a conversation. I mean, let's say that you're worried about the loss of the butterfly population. So maybe you go to your parents or friends and say, let's start a monarch project to support the monarch butterfly population. Or let's say you're concerned about, I think we've now had a 30% loss in the entire bird population in North America. So let's say you want to do something to support the bird population that's still in your area. So you may build bird houses, bird feeders, and then share that project with your parents or siblings. But yeah, I would say find something that engages you, do something and then share that experience with others. Yeah.
Okay, I think those were the last of the questions. If anybody has anything else, please put them in the chat or unmute yourself and ask. But there are some comments in here. The first one is actually about an environmental art gallery happening that Cameron's been leading. It's a big showcase happening beginning of April. Cameron, correct me if I'm wrong, please. But Tone, since you've talked so much about being an artist, we thought it might be something that interests you and also anyone else at this event. So the link for that is in the chat. Also, Melinda says, thank you so much for this conversation. So does Colton and Nancy. And also, I know you wanted us to send out your email in the chat so people could contact you.
Sure.
So feel free to do that now.
Okay. Yeah, if anyone has any questions, or maybe you're working on a project and you need some support, maybe not for me, but someone else I know around the country, I'd be more than happy to do that.
And
All right, well,
I was gonna say, and we're glad to know that you'll say no if it's too much on your plate.
I'll try.
all right, well, if no one else has any other last questions, thank you all so much for coming to this event. Tone, thank you much for taking the time to share your great work with us. And yeah, I hope everybody has a great rest of the day.